If I had a dad, I mean, something not just guys. Do you want me to inspire, right? That's what I do. Yeah. Something that won't like call my dad in a panic. I was still alive.
It was okay. Like it wasn't my above man. Yeah, it wasn't my favorite movie.
It was not
Like,
the news that I found out that
Well, good morning, everyone. I feel like it's safe to start. There are relatively, I would say there are fewer than 289 people, which is the number of people enrolled in the class here, but I feel like this might be the, the attendance today, which is understandable given the weather, which we're going to talk about decision making, but I was contemplating not leaving the house today, except I have to teach today. And you had to contemplate not leaving the house, and you maybe did because you've got class today. It's not an easy decision to make when the weather's like this. So I want to talk about decision making. We're going to mostly focus on start with a few sort of relevant examples. I've got a QR code at the very beginning because I want you to think about some cases. So there are two things I'm going to ask you about. One is decisional conflict. And in this case, it has to do with when there are too many things to decide between. You can also link to this from your device. So decisional conflict, you've got too many things to decide. Tell me write a little bit about a case in which you had too many things to think about and how you resolved that. And then the second question has to do with how you make decisions about whether or not to trust using different artificial intelligence agents in your work, life, medical decisions, legal decisions, et cetera. So take a few minutes. I don't mind waiting a few minutes, and then we can use some of that to guide our discussion, maybe in the first 10 or 15 minutes of class. I'll just kind of pace around randomly while you do this.
actually
If you just come in, I'm asking for a couple of examples. And there's a link and a QR code about times when you've experienced decisional conflict and the ways in which you've decided to trust or not trust artificial intelligence. We'll give you just a few more minutes, and then we'll look at some of the answers. Okay, you're still writing something, give you another minute or two. We've got 35 responses. That's certainly enough to get a discussion started. And you can continue to add some stuff in as you go. We got 38, even better. Let's take a look at some of these answers. So the first series of questions has to do with decisional conflict. We're going to come back to this topic of decision conflict later in today's lecture. But the idea of decisional conflict is when there are too many things to choose from. I talk about this in the textbook. It's a really common problem that a lot of us face. It's certainly a problem that you face in probably more so now than in maybe my generation as a university student. You've got more places that you can choose to, more university courses you can choose, more options that you can choose. There are more ways to get food delivered to your house. There are more places to eat, more software that you can use. There's just more to choose from, right? There are more brands, all of those kinds of things. And it's really difficult. So one of you said you have never experienced decisional conflict. Would anyone care to share that example of never experiencing decisional conflict? Or or was this sort of a meta example, like, you've only given me two choices here, Professor Minda, there's no decisional conflict, so I say no. So who out there has never experienced decisional conflict? Thought you were going to raise your hand. You did not raise your hand. That was just a movement of your hand that appeared to be a hand raising. Okay, so most of us experience decisional conflict. I have experienced this many times in my life. Somebody says, every time I go to a restaurant. Yes, every time I go to a restaurant. Choosing thesis supervisor options, choosing food from a menu I've never seen before, shopping for a grad dress. I was trying to choose which hoodie I wanted, but there were too many options, so I didn't get one and walked out of the store. Yeah, I mean, this happens to me all the time, not specifically with hoodies, but in general, you go to a store and there are too many options. Picking schools, went through some of the choices, best fit, settle on it rather than going through options. Arby's, Osmos, sushi, food court, and a weeping emoji. Going to Banff with my boyfriend and his family. Actually, that sounds kind of nice. So where to eat in the food court. So a lot of food related stuff. Picking which university. Another person choosing Arby's. I feel like Arby's is actually not a really good choice. So you could probably take that one off the list. No offense. Generally speaking, I'm a very indecisive. Choosing courses, but not this one. So a lot of us experiencing, you notice some themes that come out, right? One of the themes is where to eat. Of course, that's a really clear one. That's the one that I use in the textbook. And that's one that's, I think, probably the most salient to us, right? There are just a lot of different choices. Even places, restaurants that should limit the number of things. Always something new. Tim Hortons used to be sandwiches and donuts. They introduced wraps, then they introduced bowls, then they introduced flatbreads. There's always something new. I can't go to a Starbucks without the app in my hand because there are too many options. It's really difficult. So most of us are faced with that kind of thing, decisional conflict. The second question is, how do we resolve these kinds of things? So lots of context, too many options, overwhelmed, unsure. So we've got, have you experienced, what are some of the conflicts? Did you end up making a good decision? Some people say yes, and some people say no. So I don't have a follow-up question for this, For those of you that said yes, can anybody give me an example of a case where you were faced with decisional conflict, too many options to choose from, but you ended up making a decision that you were happy with in the end? What was the decision you made, or what are the contexts, or how did you know it was a good decision?
I'm just in general, I'm trying to like not regret my decisions because that's like the best I could have made with the information I had at the time.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. We're going to talk about it at the end of today's lecture. So many of us, turns out a lot of people make decisions with maybe not explicitly, but with the intent to avoid regretting the decision. So one good strategy sometimes, or an available strategy, is to make a decision that you don't think you're going to regret, because people don't like regret. So for somebody who answered, yes, you regretted the decision, how did you know that you regretted the decision? How did you know you made the wrong decision when faced with decisional conflict? Does anybody want to share an example? You moved your hand. Were you gonna? Yeah. Thank you.
It's like, oh, like this, right down the right option because, like, I have, I'm in something maybe that house.
Yeah.
It sounds like I should regret that option because I do.
Yeah. But what do you have? A clean house.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you do have something, right? So I think a lot of us do face this issue. And one of the reasons I wanted to start with this example is it's really common. It's common, especially in a consumer-driven society, a consumer-driven economy, that we're going to be faced with decisional conflict. A lot of products look the same. How many of you are, or any of you, thinking of a career that might involve marketing certain kinds of things, whether they're financial products, devices, in products of any kind, online products, of any sort like that. So how would you want to market a new product? You've got to decide how to set your product aside from something that's already an option. There are lots of other available options, but you've got to convince somebody to decide to take your option. And most of them aren't going to decide to take your option, because how do we usually resolve decisional conflict? With heuristics. And that's how most of us make a decision. That's the example that I use in the textbook, right? If you're faced with a lot of options at a restaurant, too many things to choose, you might just choose something that's a safe bet, something that's your standing order, something that fits what you need at the moment, something that you know you're not going to regret, even if it isn't the best decision. And that's how most of us make consumer decisions, right? We pick a brand that we like, and we stick with it. And we buy products made by that brand. We pick objects that we're familiar with, things that aren't going to induce any kind of regret. So that reduces the number of possible options. You no longer have to think about weighing the options because you just choose the same thing that you chose the last time, a recency bias. Last decision. What are the kinds of things that you trust AI with, and what kinds of things do you not trust AI with? I would not trust AI to make decisions on what I should eat at a restaurant. Okay, that's reasonable. I don't use AI, nothing and everything. So what kind of things do you trust AI with? Nothing. What kind of things do you not trust AI with? Everything. I trust AI to give me feedback and help me brainstorm ideas, but I never trust AI with making final decisions. I always review. So that's a really a reasonable answer, right? It's a particular tool that you have at your disposal. It might be able to summarize and help you weigh options. And if most of you are, familiar with interacting with a chatbot for decisions like this, it's easily swayed, right? So it can make recommendations, and it can give you pros and cons. It can also give you alternative decisions without having to think that it's giving you the wrong or the right decision. Trust for helping with school, understand lectures, but I don't trust for medical advice. I have an example somebody was telling me, it was a former student was telling me about, this was, I think, maybe this year or last year, was searching for when Western's fall break would be. If you use Google, it's going to summarize things anyway using Google Gemini, right? That's the first thing that comes up when you ask Google a question. Isn't a bunch of search information, but it's summarized information using AI. which means it can sometimes be wrong. So this student used either use Google Gemini or ChatGPT to say, when is Western's fall break? Western's fall break has been moving around a little bit. So you might choose the wrong information. Don't trust AI with that kind of information, because if Western's fall break occurs during Thanksgiving one year and then occurs around Halloween the next year, it's going to give you the wrong information. It's right based on what it's sourced. So this student almost booked a trip for the wrong week because they trusted what Google was telling them, trusted what AI was telling them. But in this case, it was the wrong information. So this is probably something that's going to be more and more relevant over the coming years because AI is going to get better at being able to predict the kinds of things that you want from it: medical advice, legal advice, financial advice. Practice quizzes, given study materials to work from. I think that's reasonable. I trust it with academics, but not medical or legal or interpersonal matter, anything that's usually settled by another person through AI. I trust AI with summarizing. I don't trust it for anything important. So in other words, it sounds to me like most of you trust artificial intelligence about as much as you trust anything else, which is you got to trust it, but you have to verify it as well, right? You might trust what's in a textbook, but not entirely, because there can be errors or there can be new information that makes your textbook seem out of date. You can trust what you experience or understand in the lecture, trust the things that I might discuss in lecture, but that's going to change from year to year. Sometimes new information causes you to not trust what your professors might tell you. So it sounds like most of us trust AI as much as we trust everyone else, which is sometimes, but not always. Any other insights on this before we go? Yeah.
I wouldn't trust AI for the full self-driving. Like, I don't believe in the electric vehicle,
Yeah.
because driving's like man-made errors, right? So if I have a robot and there's a situation where a truck comes into me, I don't think that robot's gonna know what to do.
It's a really tricky one because more and more vehicles. So if you didn't hear, trusting AI for fully automated self-driving vehicles, right? Autonomous vehicles. Has anybody ever ridden in a fully autonomous vehicle? Yeah. How did you feel?
I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
In San Francisco they had
Yeah.
these Waymos,
Yes.
and it's I think they're getting better and better at it, but from what I understand, as of right now, it's like they only have it situated
Yeah.
in one location because they train the whole system around that for now. So it's hard to kind of integrate it throughout.
So you didn't feel like you were making a bad decision. But how about you?
I had it in the turnpike in Florida, and I don't know. It's Floridian drivers are just different, so I didn't really
This is
trust it.
true.
It's what the minimum's 75, so the car was going the speed limit, and
Yeah.
you're supposed to go 20 over, 20 kilometers on miles, but
Right. So that felt a little, yeah. So there is an element of giving over trust to something else that is not a human, that's making decisions for you. And a fully automated vehicle, self-driving autonomous vehicle, is going to be making decisions for you. Whereas it takes away your ability to make driving decisions. Most of us drive cars that have a lot of semi-automated processing, whether it's an electric car or a gasoline car or a hybrid car. Most cars have a lot of stuff on them that can make decisions or help you make decisions, but usually they're kind of nudging you in one direction or the other. Sometimes they're literally nudging you if you start to drift over in the other lane, but they're not making you drive in a certain way. So fully automated vehicles, a lot of people don't feel comfortable giving over trust to a machine. This is important because if you're making decisions, one of the things we're going to talk about in decision making is that you have to trust the information. Most of the heuristics that we rely on are information that we're familiar with, available information, familiar information. And it's really difficult to try to trust some of that information. So let's move on to a discussion of decision making. What we're going to talk about for a lot of these for a lot of this class are specific examples and then some of the theories that underlie these specific examples. Now, in the message that I sent out on Brightspace yesterday, I said that we should be able to finish up early without a break. Let me know how things feel at about 10:45, so about an hour from now. If it feels like a break is necessary, we'll take a break. But if it feels like a break is not necessary, we can keep going. I have relatively less in today. So what is decision making? We're going to define decision making as a couple of things, and we're going to focus on these things when we talk about the theories. First of all, taking into account the base rates, knowing how common something is. If you're trying to make decisions about some outcomes, and some of these outcomes lead to a gain for you, you want to know how likely those gains are. So you need to know something about probability, and that's what we're going to talk about first. You want to maximize your benefits and minimize your risk and make a decision that optimizes your outcomes. And there's lots of challenges. Most of these things are uncertain. Sometimes you don't know the probability. This is going to be one of the biggest challenges for making decisions. We just don't know the probability of things, whether it's self-driving cars, making decisions about what you're going to eat or what course you're going to take. You don't always know the probability of the outcome. So we tend to make decisions on concepts, memory, and heuristics. A couple of weeks ago, how many of you watched the gold medal men's hockey game at the end of the Olympics? So I bring this one up because how many of you also watched the gold medal women's hockey game a few days earlier and were left with a feeling of disappointment and sadness? And after experiencing the sadness of the Toronto Blue Jays last year, the Buffalo Bills, and the women's hockey team, I didn't think I could take another bit of disappointment. So in the middle of the men's game, when it was still uncertain, I made a decision to go grocery shopping instead. Why? Because the outcome of the game was uncertain. What was certain was that the grocery store was going to be empty. And an empty grocery store is actually a really good outcome sometimes. You can get your shopping done quickly and easy on a Sunday morning. While everybody's watching the hockey game, there was nobody in the store. It was the best grocery store shopping experience. I did not regret my decision when I realized that it was still a loss. So I feel like I made the good decision in that case. Why? Because one was uncertain, but I knew that my reaction to the loss would be one of sadness. What was certain was I was going to have a good grocery store shopping experience. So it ended up being a decision I was happy with. I based it on my memory of what my sadness would feel like if the men's hockey team lost to the Americans. I based it on my memory of what Sunday morning at the grocery store is usually like. It's usually really crowded, but it's not crowded if everybody's watching a hockey. Let's go through these examples really quickly because I talked briefly about the COVID pandemic, which nobody really wants to talk about anymore, but it's a good example because most of you probably still have some memory of what this was like. So seasonal flu, everybody gets the flu in Canada every so often. This doesn't change from year to year. Somewhere between 5 and 20% of the population gets some kind of respiratory virus. It's just a common thing, right? It's something that we all experience. You can get a vaccine for it that can sometimes reduce your likelihood of getting the flu, but sometimes not. And every year there's a few thousand deaths in hospitals, usually among people who are already ill in other ways, or older individuals or people who are immunocompromised. So this is not something that's unusual. There's a pretty good chance that you may get sick some year, but there's a small chance that you'll get sick this year. And so we adjust our behavior accordingly. One of the reasons that early, especially in the COVID pandemic, people made what seemed like in retrospect to be kind of extreme decisions to be able to prevent the disease is that it was a relatively new disease. There was a lot that was unknown about it. The flu kills a lot of people every year in Canada and in the United States, but that's something that most of us are, at least we can understand. We can know from year to year what those base rates are going to be. We can know from year to year what the best ways to prevent the flu are going to be. We can know from year to year when to expect a spike in flu cases. But with the COVID pandemic, we didn't know what to expect. So public health officials had less to go on. Most of you probably remember, if you wouldn't have been in university then, you would have been in high school. So you would have remembered the period when everybody was sent home, right? And you would have probably remembered the period when you weren't allowed outside without a mask. You had to go shopping with a mask on. You had to go to university classes with a mask on. And you probably remember those times when masks were essentially mandated in the public, and a number of vaccines. And eventually that all just kind of disappeared. It's almost as if most people have completely, it's like we just sort of completely forgot about all of this. But a few years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, this was a really big deal. How much should we do to modify our behavior in order to prevent a pandemic? I can still remember in 2023, so 3 years ago, when masks were required for all students in all classes. I taught in this very classroom. It was the first class I taught in person. It was, I think it was cognitive psychology. First class I taught in person in 2 years, and everybody had to wear a mask all the time. None of you were in university, or were you all first years back in that time? Some of you were first years back in 2023. So you do remember that there were like mask police, right? Where you sort of were asked to put masks on in specific ways. And somewhere along the line, everybody just decided to stop wearing masks. How did we do this? How did we go from requiring masks everywhere and then in a span of a year and a half, just kind of avoid it? We decide when to wear a mask, stop worrying about making gatherings optional. Western quietly dropped a mask mandate, vaccine mandate. All of this just kind of disappeared. What's your recollection of that? How did we make those decisions? So let's explore some options, but one of the options is going to be we know more about the base rates. Once you know more about the base rates of contracting COVID, once you know more about the base rates of serious illness, once you know more about the preventability of COVID with masks, once you know more about the effectiveness of vaccines, these decisions are able to be made more effectively. So likely it was an over-reliance on familiar disease prevention mechanisms, an over-reliance on requiring people to have vaccines now, which then seem to be not very effective. Once you know more about the probabilities, you can make better decisions. One of the reasons is we've got a lot, one of the reasons it was unknown for a time is that we've got a lot of possible things that can affect you. At any given time, there's a lot of diseases out there that you can contract and get sick from. And here they're rated on a scale of contagiousness, in other words, how easily they are to catch, with a scale of deadliness. Anything up here is untreatable and pretty much deadly. So like various plagues and rabies, you have a high likelihood of death if you contract one of these diseases. Anything up here is really easy to spread. And so COVID and SARS were kind of down in this space where they live with a lot of other diseases. They might be a little bit more, just a little bit more transmissible than a common cold or a flu, but not nearly as transmissible as some of these other kinds of things like measles, which is a much more contagious disease than COVID ever was or would be. So a lot of these things are more contagious and roughly the same amount of deadliness. So we might think about the kind of vaccination that's required for things like measles and whooping cough, which most people receive vaccinations for when they're young, as being an effective tool against something like SARS or COVID. SARS and COVID isn't nearly as deadly as some of these other things like tuberculosis, the bubonic plague, untreated HIV or rabies. So we've got things to make decisions on. And once you know more about how deadly or untreatable some of these diseases are, and once you know more about how transmissible they are, the decisions can be a little bit more well-informed. Early COVID decisions were not well-informed because most public health officials didn't know what to compare them to. They didn't know where in this space COVID might be. So rational decision-making requires understanding the base rates and probabilities. So let's talk for about 15 minutes about probability theory. Most of you have had courses in probability. We talked about some of this in my cognitive psychology class. And if you've taken statistics, you've probably also talked about probability. When you've taken data science, you probably talked about probability. So we'll go through this really quickly, and then we can use it to frame some of our decisions on, or some of our discussion on decision making. So in probability, you're discussing the likelihood and uncertainty of events. Something that has a high likelihood is a high probability of occurring, meaning over all the possible observations, it's very likely to occur. With decision making, and in our theories of decision making, we're going to talk about this being a normative or prescriptive theory, meaning that we're trying to understand what would normally happen. We're not trying to make decisions about how people, or make a description about how people actually behave. We want to make decisions or make a description about how people are likely to behave. Those are two different things. The decisions that you really make and the decisions that you should make might not always align. So when we're talking about probability and rational decision making, we're talking about decision making and probabilities that describe what you should do. Or what you would do given all of the possible information. Does that make sense? So that's a distinction from the kind of descriptives that you might see, rather than what we'll discuss later when we talk about heuristics and biases. So it's a standard by which you can measure behavior. A descriptive theory, which we'll talk about in the second half of today's lecture, describes how people actually behave. So in the text, I talk about three different kinds of theories for how people come to understand probability. Probability is a mathematical construct, right? So you know what probability is. Barron's theories talk about how you as a person come to understand probabilities of events in the world. So there are kind of three possibilities. These are the most common, frequency theories. So any kind of frequency theory means that you as a person come to understand the probabilities of events based on your experience, based on past frequencies. If something happens to you a lot, then you're likely to understand that it has a high probability of occurring. If something never happens to you, you would likely develop the understanding that it has a lower probability of occurring. So we talked about diseases. So past information about flu, about COVID, about vaccines, et cetera. You don't have to raise your hand on this, but it's a really common thing to hear people say, I never get sick, right? How many of you have heard people say this? I never get sick. I never get the flu. My dad never gets sick. My brother, he never seems to get sick. So you hear people say this, I never get sick. That doesn't mean that they have special immunity. It just means that they haven't gotten sick yet. And so they likely have an understanding of the probability of being a bit lower. Maybe somebody just through bad luck has gotten sick with the flu 3 or 4 times in a row. And then you think, well, they're just always getting sick. They probably have an inflated understanding. So frequency theories are going to drive a lot of the biases that we talk about because they're going to be based on your personal experience. It has to do with the frequency of information, requires knowledge of past frequency in order to work. This is how most of us make decisions and understand the probability of events. But there are two other possibilities. One is the idea of a logical theory. A logical theory in this case means that you have real outside observations. Information based on logic and knowledge of likelihood. Not just your own experience with the frequency of events, but understanding real probabilities. This works really well for what I talk about in the text as exchangeable events, things for which the probabilities don't change even when the circumstances do. So when we talk about examples using gambling with cards or flipping a coin or something like that, those are exchangeable events because the coin doesn't matter, right? The cards don't matter. The deck of cards or the time of day that you draw a certain hand from a deck of cards isn't going to matter. The probabilities stay the same. So some things can be based in logical probability in a way that's different from your personal experience. And you can see how these things might come into conflict. If you know that there's a certain probability of a particular hand being drawn in a game of poker, and you happen to get that hand twice, you might think that you're lucky. which I suppose you are lucky. So it might make you believe that there is something else at stake other than the logical probabilities. And that's going to be an example known as the gambler's fallacy. When you think that your own personal sort of personal experience with something changes the logical probabilities. So logical probabilities are based in logic. A third category, which includes both frequency but also beliefs, Barron refers to as personal theories. And these are things that are kind of not quite captured by frequency, but might be captured by irrational belief. So you may believe that you are less likely to get sick, not just because of frequency, but maybe because of something else. You might believe that, in a certain approach to doing something. You might believe that you're a particularly lucky person at placing bets. You might believe certain things. So this might include some frequency, might include some irrational beliefs, supernatural beliefs.
Well, like frequency theory, like kind of falls under personal theory in a way.
They overlap a bit. So personal theories is meant to sort of bring in things that might not have frequency at all, but still have outcomes based on your own personal beliefs about things. Maybe a belief about how the world works that you have no direct experience with, that you have no frequency experience, but you still believe that something is more or less likely based on some other kind of knowledge. Does that make sense? So it's a way to capture that other kind of knowledge and belief that isn't strictly frequency-based. So in Barron's suggestion, all three of these play a role when we're making decisions. We track information about the frequency of events by making observation, and that's susceptible to memory bias, right? You might remember some things more than others. We might fail to remember cases when we made the wrong decision. Most of you talked about some decisional conflict. And one of the themes that kind of comes up is that we don't like to experience regret. So maybe we just don't remember the possible other outcomes. We tend to think that we made the right decision. So these logical theories might conflict with frequency theories, and personal theories bring them all together by adding some extra background knowledge. So within logical theories, these are things like the kind of standard probability that you're familiar with, right? So flipping a coin, it's got a chance of a heads or a tails. When I talk about probability, when we talk about probability in a logical or a rational model of decision making, we're talking about something that is occurring over the long run. So possibly over an infinite amount of occurrence. So if something has a 1.0 probability of occurring, that means it always occurs. There's no chance for it not to occur. It will always occur. If it has a 0 probability, it will never occur. Probability that we experience is usually somewhere in between, where things occur sometimes and they don't occur some other times. And our job is to try to figure out whether our frequency information maps onto logical probability. So flipping a coin with a heads or tails, I'll go through this all really quickly. You've got one desired outcome and two possible outcomes, so it has a 50% chance of heads at any given time. And you can flip a coin lots of times and get heads. It doesn't change the probability, right? So you know that a distribution of heads and tails that might seem unrandom is still a random distribution, because over 1,000 tosses, 500, around 500 might be expected to be a heads. You'll never have the exact number, but you might. If you get 10 heads in a row, what's more likely? Another head or another tail? And most of us know, even if we are sort of feeling like it should be a tails at this point, because it feels like it should be balancing out. We also know that each individual coin toss is independent. And so that every coin toss still has that 50% chance. It could still be a heads. How many of you have purchased a cup of Tim Hortons coffee and rolled up the rim recently? Have you won anything? Does anybody want to roll up the rim? What did you win?
A coffee.
Another coffee. Yeah, that's usually what you want, right? Just another coffee. Has anybody ever won anything big on a Tim Hortons?
When I was 10, I won a car.
You won a car when you were 10?
Yeah.
That's the most extraordinary piece of information that has ever been uttered in one of my classes. When I was 10, I won a car. What did you do with a car when you were 10?
Oh, we traded it in for money.
That's an excellent decision because you couldn't drive it when you were 10. And by the time you could drive it, it would be in a car. I got to say, in all the times I've ever asked about this, no one has ever rolled up the rim and won a car. This is unbelievable. I believe it. This is just a fantastic piece of information. Because one time, a couple of years ago, I rolled up the rim 35 times in a row and never did anything. And I was really starting to get kind of frosted by this. I was like, you're supposed to have like a 1 in 12 chance of winning. And I'm like on almost number 40 rolling up the rim. And I'm expecting a win each time. And it just made me keep going back for more. I mean, I'm already addicted to the coffee anyway, so I didn't need a whole lot of help. So I'm getting coffee and I'm like, one of these days I'm going to get a win. But then at some point I started thinking, I want to see how long I can get this losing streak to keep going. Like the likelihood of getting that many losses in a row is kind of low. So most of us roll up the rim expecting to get maybe a free cup of coffee every so often, or maybe a free donut, unfortunately, every so often. But usually it's please play again. I have never expected to win a car, and I've never expected anybody to say they won a car.
I haven't won anything since.
So it's that's pretty bad. So it's like you got it all once when you were 10. It's like I got the car. What kind of car level?
Honda Civic.
Honda Civic. I like this story. So you want a Honda Civic. I'm going to remember this. So most of us know that these events are so this is an exchangeable event. Every year, Tim Hortons tells you how many chances of winning there are. There's a finite number of winning cups out there. They print them up in advance and then distribute them by province. You can go to the Tim Hortons website and find out how many winners are available in each province in Ontario that Tim Hortons operates. So you kind of know what your base rates are. You kind of know what the logical probability is. And you know that if you played a lot, you'd eventually win something, right? So it might not be a car, but you know that if you theoretically purchased every cup of coffee that was ever printed up in the province of Ontario, there'd be a winner, there'd be a car winner in there somewhere. You wouldn't probably conduct your life that way, but you could do that, right? So that's what this probability is supposed to be. Over all the possible occurrences this year, there are a certain number of winning cars, winning coffees, winning whatever else it is, $1,000 gift cards or something. So you can calculate probability, whether it's with Tim Hortons cups or dice or cards or tossing a coin to get a heads or a tails. It's really just trying to figure out the number of desirable outcomes divided by all of the possible outcomes. It's really simple when there's only one desirable outcome and 6 possible outcomes. A probability of rolling a 6 on regular die is 167. A possibility of rolling a number less than 4, that's 3 desired outcomes, 6 possible outcomes is 0.5. So you can see how the base rates are unchangeable. There's always something constant with these exchangeable events. For any particular hand in poker, if it's a full deck and you're the first person to draw cards from it, any of these 2 sets of cards are equally likely. One of them is meaningful in poker, but each card has the same probability of being drawn, and it can't be drawn again. So all of these things are fairly stable. That's what I mean by an exchangeable event. Doesn't matter what day you draw the cards, doesn't matter what day you toss the coin, you're going to have the same outcomes. These are all independent. So the outcome of one event does not influence the next. After getting 2 heads, the probability of getting another head is still a 50. After rolling up the rim and getting a coffee, the probability of getting another coffee is exactly the same. So you won't be able to see dependence with one thing on the other. And confusing this is one way in which people fall for a gambler's fallacy. A gambler's fallacy means assuming that independent events are actually dependent. So if you believe you're on a streak with something, if you believe you're on a winning streak or a losing streak. I believed that I was on a long losing streak with my roll up the rim losing streak. And so for a while, I actually was thinking like, I'm going to buy my coffee at Tim Hortons every single day that year because I really wanted to see how long I could get this streak. Like I felt like I was going to get one. I was due for a win. So I was falling for a gambler's fallacy. I mean, I was obviously aware of that, and I needed the coffee anyway. And it was just sort of a way to entertain myself. When there's multiple outcomes, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated because rarely do we find ourselves in a case where we're making decisions about things that are logical, exchangeable, and completely independent. It's really only in simplified examples that that happens. Most of us are in complex scenarios. Even if you like gambling, which I don't, but if you were a gambler, you're going to find yourself in a complex scenario with lots of possible odds and outcomes, not a simplified scenario like the one that we're talking about. So in multiple outcomes, there are a couple of different ways to think about it. One are conjunctive probabilities, and we call this the AND rule, meaning that the probability of getting two things is multiplied. The probability of getting a heads and another heads, in other words, two heads on a coin toss in a row, is multiplied, meaning that the probability of both events is much lower than the probability of either one event. We've already talked about conjunctions in the past. We'll come back to that one on the next few slides, but the example of Linda, the feminist bank teller, is an example of people ignoring the conjunctions, right? So you ignore the likelihood of a single event and assume that a conjunction is actually higher than it should be. We also have to face or understand cumulative probabilities. Cumulative probabilities are what I think most of us are a lot more familiar with, which is over a long number of occurrences, the probability of getting a particular outcome or receiving a particular outcome. You might think of this as or, because over time you add the probabilities. The probability of getting two heads or two tails might be given by adding up the probability of two heads and adding the next probability of two heads. The more times you do the, toss the coin, the more likely it is that you're going to get one of these. Most of us might have some indirect experience with this, with driving. So when you're driving, I wouldn't ask for you to raise your hands, but how many of you have caught yourself looking at your device while you're driving? I've certainly seen lots of other people look at their device while they're driving. I think I've talked about this in class before, right? So you can certainly see other people looking at their device while they're driving, sometimes straight down at the device and not in front of them. What kind of decision are they making? What's the decision that you make when you decide to look at your device instead of at the road while you're driving? Well, one of the possibilities is you're deciding that, look, from a personal, logical, from a frequency occurrence, I've never been in an accident before, so maybe I'm lucky. Maybe I'm really good at looking down at my phone and then looking back up, because every time I look down and look up, there's nobody right in front of me. So from your perspective, from your brain's perspective, it's not making a bad decision. I mean, you actually are making a very bad decision, but your brain doesn't think you're making a bad decision, because what your brain is thinking is, I've never been in an accident before. Every time I drive and use my smartphone, I get to where I'm going safely. I've never run anybody over. I've never run off the road. I've never crossed the lane and driven into someone else. So for the most part, your brain is probably making a well-informed decision based on its own tracking of frequencies. And so what you're doing is making that erroneous judgment by ignoring the cumulative probabilities. If there's only a tiny fraction that the one time that you happen to look down at your phone, someone has crossed over into your lane a little bit and you didn't have time to get away. Or the one time that you look down at your phone, a dog has run across the street, or a person has stepped in front of you and you should have stopped. Or the car in front of you stopped and you didn't see them, so you rear-ended them. That doesn't happen very often. But if it has a very low probability of occurring today, it's going to have a low probability of occurring tomorrow. And over many days, many months, and many years, those low probabilities start to add up. So it means that you may be making a good decision now, but over the long run, it could happen. And it increases the probability of it happening cumulatively every time you make the decision to look at your smartphone while you're operating a motor vehicle. We talked about this one already, so I'll go through it quickly, but this is an example of how we ignore some of these rules. The previous example I talked about with driving, that's ignoring cumulative probabilities. When we talked about Linda, 31 years old, outspoken and bright, majored in philosophy, a student concerned with issues of social justice and discrimination. And then we ask participants to rate the probability that Linda is a school teacher, works in a bookstore, does yoga, active in a feminist movement, a social worker, a bank teller, and feminist. Most people rate that as being more probable, suggesting that they ignore this conjunction. They ignore the and. If Linda is 75, 80, even 90% likely to be active in the feminist movement and is a low probability of being a bank teller, let's say 25, you would multiply those together because the likelihood that she's one, the likelihood that she's other, that's an and. One isn't dependent on the other. They're independent probabilities in this case. And it would likely point you logically to saying that bank teller and feminist is the least likely of those three. Most of us don't agree with that. Most of us, and what Kahneman and Tversky found is that most people don't use that reasoning when they make a decision about what Linda is most likely. Because we're swayed by our knowledge and personal beliefs about what kind of person would be a feminist or what kind of person would be a bank teller. And so that's where these frequency and especially personal theories come in. It's a personal theory for what you think a kind of person would be and what kind of outcome or what kind of behaviors they might enjoy. Does that make sense to everybody? Bayes' theorem, how many of you are familiar with Bayesian statistics or Bayesian reasoning? So Bayesian statistics and Bayesian reasoning are all about looking at sort of a frequency of occurrence, the probabilities of occurrence, and then trying to predict what you can infer from evidence on a particular case. But I want to talk about Bayes' theorem a little bit because it's going to come back when we talk about how people make decisions about the outcome of a medical test or the outcome of a diagnostic assessment of some kind. Bayes' theorem we think of as a prescriptive theory for how people should reason about probabilities. And it's kind of based on mathematical analysis of the nature of probability. And we often don't agree in our behaviors with Bayesian reasoning. So we can understand what Bayesian reasoning is. We can understand how Bayes' theorem works. Our behavior suggests we don't always use it in our decision making. So we want to define three things. First, we want to define in Bayesian terms what's known as a prior probability. In decision-making terms later, I'm going to refer to this as the base rate. These two things are synonymous for our purposes. So prior probabilities are the number of times that something has happened, and that's the base rate in the population, especially if we're talking about disease. The probability that a hypothesis is true before consideration of the evidence. In other words, how likely is something going to be true before you even make an observation about it? This is the information that we rarely have the actual answer for. We don't usually know what base rates are. We have some limited information about what the base rates might be. So the more you know about prior probabilities, the better your decisions are going to be. Conditional probabilities. This is the probability that a particular type of evidence is true if a particular hypothesis is true. You define this as the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis. And the posterior probability is the probability that a hypothesis is true after observing the evidence. So we have information about base rates, we have information about the hypothesis, and we have information about the combination of the two. Bayes' theorem specifies how to combine prior probabilities, your information or your knowledge about the base rate of occurrence of a hypothesis with conditional probabilities of the evidence to determine the posterior probability of the hypothesis. In other words, should you trust this evidence? What do you take from evidence? If you know something about the base rate, and when you have a hypothesis about the base rate, you collect some evidence, knowing whether or not this is the right kind of evidence to collect. What can you determine from that evidence? Let's go through a couple of examples, and then we're going to talk about how people don't do a good job with this unless you really make it simple for them. This is, in many cases, this is going to be similar to what we talked about when we talked about logical reasoning and deduction. Most people can understand this. Most of us can calculate probabilities. Most of us can do this, but it's not straightforward. It's resource intensive, and so we rely on heuristics and biases. So here's an example that uses a type of reasoning, and we're going to go through this as a probability problem. The premise, so this is like a deductive task. If a burglar is in the house, I don't want to ask anybody to put their hands up for how many times you've had your apartment broken into, but imagine that it's happened. It certainly has happened to somebody. If it hasn't happened to you, it's probably happened to somebody you know. It hasn't happened to me recently, but when I was a kid, somebody broke into our house. We came home and the door was ajar. Stuff was all spread out on the lawn, that kind of thing. So we kind of knew like somebody probably broke into the house, right? We saw the people leaving the house. So made a pretty good distinction there. So if a burglar is in the house, then the door will be ajar. That's just a premise. Forget whether or not it's a valid premise. We're just going to start with this as a premise. So if there's a burglar in the house, then the door is going to be left ajar. You come home and your door is open. First of all, that's not natural, right? If you come home to your house or your apartment and the front door is open, you probably think, oh, that's not right. What can I infer from that evidence? So the problem we have to face here is, what do I take from my observation that the front door is open? Do you conclude that a burglar is in the house? Well, we can already start off by saying that logically, this is sort of a non-valid deduction, meaning that we're going to have to rely on probabilities instead, because this is affirming the consequence. Logically, this does not give us enough evidence. So now we have to collect more evidence. We need to know something about whether or not you live in an unsafe neighborhood, whether or not burglars really leave the door open. So let's say that the probability of a house in my neighborhood of being burglarized on any particular day is 1 in 1,000. Actually, that's a really terrible neighborhood. But I'm just using whole numbers here to make it easy. Hopefully you don't live in a neighborhood where on any given day, there's a 1 in 1,000 chance of a house being broken into. This probability would be expressed as the probability H, 1 in 1,000, or 0.001. So you can express it in both ways. Before we go any further, which of those two ways seems easier for you to understand? Number 1, 1 in 1,000, or number 2, 0.001? Which one makes more sense to you intuitively? How many people like the first one? That are odds. How many people like the second one? Okay. There's no right answer. But it turns out that when people are faced with complex situations, whole numbers make it easier to reason sometimes, because you can think through the cases and you can map it onto personal frequencies a little bit easier. These are equivalent mathematically, but many people, even highly experienced people in their domain, find it easier to reason when they're given whole numbers like this. But let's go on. The probability, that means the probability of a house in my neighborhood not being burglarized is 1 minus that, so 0.999. In other words, 999 times out of 1,000, i.e. most of the time, the house is not being burglarized, even in this high crime neighborhood that you have on yourself. So the probability that that's the posterior, and the base rate. Probability, this is a conditional probability that a particular type of evidence is true if a particular hypothesis is true. In other words, how likely is it that an open door would actually occur after a burglary? Is this good evidence? That's what we're trying to answer with the conditional probability. Is this a good piece of evidence? I'm just making up a number here. Let's say it's 80% of the time. In other words, most of the time, but not all of the time, when burglars break into your house, they leave the door open when they break in. I guess they leave it open so that they don't lock themselves in and reactivate the alarm or something like that. I don't know what the reason is, but we're just using this as an example. So the probability of the evidence given this particular hypothesis is 0.8. That means that we can also look at the other side of it. How likely is it that an open door would occur, but not after a burglary? In other words, this is the probability of the same evidence, open door, for some other reason. By the way, it's this that makes it a non-logical deduction, because there is always this other reason for the door to be open. I'm just saying 1% of the time, this might be the chance that you just happen to leave and not close the door. You leave for class in the morning, and for whatever reason, you had to go back in, get your lunch, and you forgot to close it when you came back out. So there's always a chance that your door was left open because you left it open, right? It wasn't a burglary. You close it almost all of the time, but maybe 1% of the time, there's a chance that you just left it open because you're thoughtless. Or your roommate is thoughtless. There's always a chance you have a thoughtless roommate who comes in, forgets to lock the door. Or you have a thoughtless sibling who leaves the garage door open after they come home, something like that. So the posterior probability, this is what you want to know because you are getting home and you're faced with an open door and you don't know what to do. Is there a burglar in my house or not? And that's going to inform the next decision that you make. Because if you don't think there's a burglar in the house, you're just going to walk in and say, well, that's kind of weird. Maybe I'll just yell and see if there's anybody in here, but I'm not going to freak out. But if you really think there's a burglar in the house and there's a lot of evidence for it, you're probably not going to go into the house, right? You might call the police, or you might be really anxious or vigilant when you walk into your house. So the decision is going to be made after weighing the evidence. This is the probability that the hypothesis, burglar in the house, is true after seeing the evidence. Door is open. You calculate this by taking all of the things that are desirable, in this case, door open, burglar there, by all of the possibilities below. So the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence would be determined or calculated by the probability of the evidence of the hypothesis times the probability of the hypothesis being true, divided by all of the other occurrences. Let's put the numbers in. So 0.8, that's the likelihood that the burglar leaves the door open. 0.001, that's the likelihood that somebody else left the door open. And then we take these, multiply them, and add to them these and multiply them. So these are the things that are consistent with burglar. These are the things that are not consistent with burglar. And what you come up with is 0.07, meaning that you've divided small number by a very big number. Which also means that because burglary isn't very common, it only happens 1 out of every 1,000 times, that even though burglars mostly leave the door open, when you see the door open, it's still probably some other reason. You have lots of reason to think burglars leave the door open. You never leave the door open. But because burglary is a low base rate, posterior probability, even this evidence doesn't give you a lot of confidence. It's a very low likelihood. So most of the time, you're going to still find that the door was left open for some other reason. Even though that doesn't happen very often, it's still more likely than it being evidence that a burglar is actually in the house. So does this all seem fairly clear to everyone? We're going to go through this in 3 other ways in the next examples with using different kinds of information. But essentially, the story is that this is a lot of resource-intensive computation. Most of us don't have the ability to carry out this kind of calculation without additional aids, right? Without a calculator, without a pen and paper, without a smartphone. Most of us don't have base rate information. So we base our decisions on what we recognize and what's familiar. In other words, we base our decisions on system 1 output and not system 2 output. Furthermore, even when we're given base rates, because we're not used to using them, the evidence suggests that we ignore it anyway. It sounds great to say if only we had the base rates, we would be able to make good decisions. If only we knew about the posterior probabilities, we'd make good decisions. But it turns out that even if you're given base rate information, you still let system 1 take over. Here's another example from Kahneman and Tversky. If you can imagine there are 100 people in a room, 70 are lawyers and 30 are engineers. So there's about 70 people in this room right now. So, or about 100 people in this room right now, let's say. That would mean that about from here to about halfway through here are all lawyers. Everybody from here on over, you're going to go to law school, you're going to be lawyers. Everybody over here is an engineer. So lots of lawyers, very few engineers. Now I mix you all up in a different order with 70% lawyers, 30% engineers. I turn my back and I pick a person at random from the seat. I have numbered seats. What's the likelihood that randomly I pick a lawyer? going to be 70%. Right? I mean, that's what that base rate means. That if I don't know who I'm picking and I just pick somebody at random, it should be 70%. That is the base rate. I got a base rate of 70 lawyers in the room. And then the person I pick says, my name is Jack. I'm a 55-year-old married man with 4 kids. I'm conservative. I'm careful. I'm ambitious. I don't show any interest in social or political interest. Not interested. I spend my free time doing carpentry, woodworking, sailing, and computers. How likely is it that Jack is a lawyer versus an engineer? And what Kahneman and Tversky found is that most people said engineer because they thought that this sounded like a stereotype of an engineer more than it sounded like the stereotype of a lawyer. Even though lawyers are far more likely, more than twice as likely, people ignore the base rates. So when you're given a base rate and it conflicts with what you know or believe about the state of the world, you go with your beliefs. When you're given a base rate and it conflicts with your heuristics or something that comes from system 1, you go with system 1. People ignore the base rates in this case because it just sounds like an engineer in this case, right? And of course, you got a 30% chance of picking an engineer. It's not like you would never get an engineer. But people don't agree with the base rates, so they ignore the base rates. This is known as base rate neglect. Because we're not used to having this information, we don't tend to make decisions with this information. Even when we're given the information, we don't know how to use it. We rely on our heuristics. I feel like I was probably going to ask you to make exactly the same decision. This is a really quick decision-making example, and now I cannot remember which one it is. This is just oh, no, this is a different one. It's not the engineer lawyer, otherwise it would have been a useless example. Please do a quick survey on this. It's just going to ask you to make a multiple choice question. And then we're going to look at the answers. Only take that a second. In terms of decision making, we're going to look at this example, and then we're going to discuss a piece of literature that talks about it, and then we're going to go through another description of it. And then I realized we still have to get through prospect theory, which means that my decision to not have a break today might have not been a good one. So I'm probably, once we get through discussing this example, we might want to take a 5-minute break, if that sounds okay to everybody. I think we'll still finish up early, but I think I was a little overzealous when I was looking at the sheer number of slides I had. It was a little bit lower than usual. I don't think it's going to be able to be got through in a reasonable amount of time. So I make lots of bad decisions every single day. This might have been one of them. Try to go on without a break. Okay, Microsoft would love your perspective. How likely are you? Who answers questions like this? Who's out there recommending the web version of PowerPoint to anyone? Is this a thing that you would recommend to anybody? How likely am I? I'm not likely to recommend it. Okay, let's look at your answers here. Oh, somebody asked, are we going to have to know these mathematical equations? Yeah, you won't have to know how to work out a probability example. That's a great question. But you will have to be familiar with how to set these up. So that's true for that delta rule that we talked about, and that'll be true for Bayes' theorem. So you should be able to understand theoretically what these equations are getting at without having to work your way through them. I'll talk more about the final exam next week, but I'll have a study guide like I did the last time. So a clear study guide that tells you exactly what. Let's look at our outcomes. Decision making. 37 responses. So this has to do with understanding the likelihood of test results. We're going to talk about this in 2 or 3 different ways. This is actually one of these cases where a lot of physicians are probably likely to give over information to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence isn't going to make mistakes on cases like this. A well-designed decision-making algorithm, disease hypothesis algorithm, is going to give the best possible information. And then it's up to a physician to interpret that, right? Because most physicians even if they're really good experienced physicians, don't always reason through these tasks correctly. So assume that you conduct breast cancer screening using mammography in a certain region. You know the following information about the women in this region. The probability that a woman has breast cancer is 1% prevalence. That's a base rate. So it's a low base rate. So most people don't. If a woman has breast cancer, the probability she tests positive is 90%. That's the sensitivity of a test. So that's a good test. I mean, mammogram in this case is a really good test for the outcome. If a woman does not have breast cancer, the probability she will nevertheless test positive, in other words, show a mammography result that's indicative of breast cancer, even when it's not really there, false positive, is 9%. It's a little higher than you'd like to see in a diagnostic test. Okay, so you know the base rates and you know those conditional probabilities. This is a really clear Bayesian test. A woman tests positive. You can see how this is exactly parallel to the door open burglar example. A woman tests positive. She wants to know from you whether that means she has breast cancer for sure or what the chances are. And this is important because it's going to mean tests, treatment, etc. And you've got some options. The probability she has breast cancer is about 81%. Out of 10 women with positive mammogram, 9 have breast cancer. That's that sensitivity. Out of 10 women with a positive mammogram, 1 has breast cancer. The probability she has breast cancer is about 1%. So those are 4 possible options that you might choose. And let's look at what most of us chose. So the dominant answer for us is red, 34. Out of 10 women with a positive mammogram, 9 have breast cancer. That relies directly to the sensitivity of the test, right? Because we said that 90% effective. And that's how you would translate that. The next most likely is out of 10 women with a positive mammogram, 1 has breast cancer. And then we're kind of split a little bit on sort of just going with the base rate or just going with the another alternative version of a base rate. The positivity probability she has breast cancer is about 1%. So 81%. So there's 4 possible options. The most likely that we chose is the one that corresponds directly with the sensitivity of the test. Let's look at what physicians say about something like this. This is research. Let me make this meeting controls. So there's a lot of interest in this kind of thing because people have to make decisions based on evidence in clinical settings all the time. I mean, that's what physicians do on a large basis is they see patients, they assign tests, they give you blood tests, they give you screenings, x-rays, et cetera, and you want to determine whether or not if something shows up on that, is it meaningful? Is it clinically significant? And does it mean something that we need to act on? Gerd Geigerinzer is one of the key names that you'll see in a lot of this research about how people make decisions with statistics or heuristics. And he's interested in helping doctors and patients make better decisions because we're often given different kinds of decisions. And he gave participants exactly the same question that you just saw. One of us, GG, meaning Gerd Geigerinzer, trained about 1,000 gynecologists in risk communication. So they were interested in getting MDs to be better able to communicate risks to their patients. And at the beginning, they asked a group of them to carry out exactly the same test that you found. So this is the same thing that you answered. So these are, prior to their intervention, these are 160 experienced MDs. What they found was before training, this is the way that they've shown the statistics, before training, what they've shown is that most people actually went with the answer that you did. 47% of their physicians chose the answer that said she's got a 90% chance. The one that goes with the conditional probabilities. So she's got a 90% chance of having breast cancer because of the positive test. That's what a majority of physicians said. A small minority chose one of the answers. Another small minority chose the other answer. And the second highest answer was the second highest answer for this class, which is the 10%. So 1 in 10 chance. After the intervention, which we'll talk about in just a minute, they found that after training, most of their gynecologists made the correct decision. The correct decision in this case is 1 in 10. Because although the test is sensitive at 90%, the breast cancer rate is still fairly low in this particular population. So it's that combination of posterior and conditional that seem to be escaping the physicians in this particular case, and would have been behind any of the other incorrect answers for our sample. What they said was, do physicians lack a gene for understanding health statistics? No. Once again, health statistics are commonly framed in a way that tends to cloud physicians' minds. The information is presented in terms of conditional probabilities, which includes sensitivity and the false positive rate. Just as absolute risks foster greater insight than relative risks, there is a transparent representation that can achieve the same comparison, and that is what we call natural frequencies. And that's what I asked earlier when I said, which is easier, 0.001 or 1 in 1,000? And when things are presented to people in a format that is 1 in 1,000, so 10 out of every 1,000 people will have breast cancer. One of these 10 women with breast cancer, 9 test positive. Of the 990 women without cancer, about 89 nevertheless test positive. When you give people natural frequencies based in whole numbers, it's much easier to reason. It's easier to see that a positive test in this case is not likely to be very informative. So a positive test doesn't necessarily tell you much in this case. Positive test usually tells you need to do more tests. Most physicians know this. Even though they failed this particular multiple choice question, physicians understand that when you get a positive test result, it doesn't mean you have cancer. It often means you need to have more screening to eliminate other possible diagnoses. With more screening, it also means that you increase the base rate. Now you're testing people who have already tested positive. That's a smaller group. Those people are more likely to have breast cancer or more likely to have some other kind of cancer. And so what they're showing here is that we can't do this. It's very difficult for us to carry out this kind of equation in our minds when we have to quickly make a decision, taking 0.01, multiplying it by 0.9, dividing it by the sum of 0.01 times 0.9 and the sum of 0.99 plus 0.01. It's a lot easier for it to do this. 9 divided by 8 plus 89. That gives us the understanding, even without knowing how to calculate the actual number, that it's going to be a small number, that it's going to be a low risk. And so natural probabilities are easier. It maps onto that frequency theory that Baron was talking about. We have a lot more experience thinking about the number of times we've experienced somebody with a positive test, the number of times that a person might have a test positive, even if they don't have the disease. This came up when we talked about COVID tests. How many of you probably have an expired COVID test sitting somewhere in a drawer somewhere? Those tests that we all had access to had pretty decent outcomes. When they tested positive, it probably meant you had COVID. They didn't give false reports. They tended to not give false negative. What they did was they missed a lot. Depending on how you gave the test, they might miss a positive. They had a high miss rate, but not a very high false positive rate. So they didn't give you a positive outcome very often if you really had COVID. So let's talk about base rate neglect, but let's do so after a quick break. Does that sound okay? It does occur to me that a few people are probably maybe dozing off a little bit, because I can sort of see them here if you're dozing off. So let's take a 10-minute break, come back, and we should still be able to finish up before 12.
Then like most people's like high energy.
Yeah, you're already better than me.
I can turn it on.
Okay.
Okay, why don't we continue? It seems like everybody's more or less back. So we left off discussing an example of how physicians fail to reason properly with conditional probabilities. So in other words, physicians giving information that they should be experienced getting, which is understanding the base rates of a disease, giving indication about how sensitive a test is, the number of false alarms, without any particular intervention. If they're just asked to evaluate that probability information, the majority of them chose the wrong answer. In other words, they chose an answer that was consistent with most non-experienced physicians choose. They choose an answer that overestimates the likelihood that the person with the positive test actually has the disease. So the question is, and what that particular study was looking at, was, is there a different way to present information that more aligns with your understanding of frequencies? If your understanding with frequencies is based on direct observation of individual cases, then whole numbers would be a little bit easier to understand. So let's break this down a little bit more. So I'm going to use this essentially logically the same answer, different numbers and slightly different characteristics. But the idea is the same. We're going to talk about a disease. We're going to talk about the likelihood of that disease, the prior probability and the base rates of that disease. And we're going to talk about the positive and negative outcomes of different tests and what you can infer from that. So let's start with this example. And this again has the idea of base rate neglect. With lawyers and engineers, we suggested that humans generally ignore base rates, even when they have access to them. To some extent, that's also what was happening with the physicians. When the information was given in the form of a probability, physicians were ignoring the base rate, or they weren't able to use it. It wasn't that they were ignoring it willingly, they just weren't able to use it to make a quick decision. So a serious disease has a base rate of 1%. Let's just say it affects 100 in every 10,000 people. We can express this in any way we want, whole number wise, but it has a 1% base rate. 1 in 100, 100 out of every 10,000, and in 1,000. There's a lot of different ways to express this information. So we got a serious disease that has a 1% base rate, and it's the same base rate that existed in the previous example we looked at. A treatment exists, but the treatment is costly and risky, so a test also exists. So we've got a couple of different things you've got to take into account. First off, base rate of the disease itself. It's low, but it's a serious disease. Second, if you're going to do something about this, if you're going to treat it, it's an expensive treatment and it's also a risky treatment. Any kind of treatment involves a certain amount of risk. For any particular kind of medical intervention, there's always some degree of risk, even if it's a relatively low risk intervention. A couple of years ago, I went through a procedure to fix atrial fibrillation, so a heart problem that I was having that involves inserting an electrode, a wire, through a vein in your leg, the whole way up inside your heart, and then it burns off some of the cells inside one of the chambers of your heart to stop erratic heartbeats. Apparently, it's a really safe procedure. It didn't sound like it when they said you're going to go through this catheter ablation. You're going to burn off some cells inside your heart chamber while your heart's actually burning. And we're going to do this while you're under general anesthesia. You'll wake up and your heart will be beating properly. Minor procedure, they said. You'll be out of the hospital that same afternoon. And I was. It was a minor procedure. It was completely successful. But it kind of sounds a little risky. And I guess in theory it could be. They could, poke something the wrong way or burn off the wrong cells or something like that. So low cost, not much risk. That was a pretty safe procedure, but lots of other procedures aren't so safe. They might involve a lot more risk, especially any kind of surgical intervention. So if you want to diagnose somebody, you want to make sure that you've made the right diagnosis. In my case, it couldn't just be one AFib event. It would have to be a whole series of them that was getting worse that they would want to recommend this. If I just had an erratic heartbeat 1 or 2 times, no big deal. But if you have an erratic heartbeat that's happening every few weeks or every few months and it doesn't shift, then maybe you want to do something, and this low risk alternative might be a good treatment. So we've got a disease, we've got a treatment, we've got a level of risk, and we've also got a test. And this test is better than the one we discussed before. 98% of the time, it's going to give you a positive hit rate, and only 1% of the time, it's going to give you a false positive. This is a great test. It's mostly accurate when you have this disease, and it rarely gives you a false positive. So given a positive test, patient comes in, they test positive for whatever it is. How likely is it that the person has the disease? In Bayesian terms, what do you conclude or what do you infer from a positive test? What are the posterior probabilities? How likely is it that the person has this disease? You probably can't do this in your head to come up with the exact number. This is not the kind of thing most people can do in their head without having to have a lot of extra time and resources. So if you're just asked to make a quick decision, you're going to go with probably the success of the test. You say, well, 98% hit rate, 98% of the time, if a person tests positive, they probably have the disease. That's a reasonable decision. It would be wrong, but that would be a reasonable decision for your brain to want to make. So let's look at this in the same way that we looked at the Bayesian example earlier. So Bayes' theorem, or any other kind of way you want to couch this of using prior information to infer something, is going to ask you to think about 4 different possibilities. We've got the test results, which are positive and negative, and we've got disease present and disease absent. So we got 4 different cells, and this is what the smiley face was doing in the Gigerenzer example before. When you were given whole numbers, it's really easier for you to say, what is the probability of this divided by adding together 2 whole numbers? A lot harder when you have to use decimals and you're multiplying things together. This we can do, A divided by A plus B. And it's really easy when there's whole numbers. And that's why whole numbers seem to work. We can do the mathematics easier, and we can also, it aligns with our tendency to think about individual limits. So let's put whole numbers in here. Assume that 100 in every 10,000 people have this disease. It's a low base rate. It's a base rate of 1%. That means that when there's a test positive, because we already know that the test has a 98% positivity rate, 100 people have this disease. 98 of them, 98% of that have positive test disease present, and that means 2 of them are missed in this 98% success rate. So of the 100 out of 10,000 people that actually have this disease, you catch all but 2 of them. That's pretty good, right? The problem for you as a decision maker comes from the other side of it. Because if only 100 people have the disease, that means 990 people do not. 9,900 people do not have this disease. That's all the rest of the people in the sample that are not affected by this disease. And with the low false positive rate, that means that you get 1% of them. In other words, that's 99. You miss most of them. They get a negative result. Disease is absent, 9,801. But that means that for 99 people, a small percentage of the people that don't have it, it's only 1%. But in whole numbers, it's actually kind of a lot. And as you can easily see in this table, that's almost the same number of people that actually test positive and do have it. You got 98 people disease present positive. You got 99 people test positive, disease absent. This is not looking good for you as a very diagnostic test. And that's why whole numbers help, because you can see some of these things evidently. This is not a very effective test. In other words, it's basically a chance. You're not going to actually have a very effective test. This test doesn't tell you much about whether or not this person has the disease. What this test does tell you, from a physician's standpoint, is that you need to look more closely at this person. What would you do if you were a physician, and this is, let's say, some type of cancer, Let's say it's colon cancer, which is a cancer that most people want you to detect through early screening, like a colonoscopy, for example. So if it's colon cancer, which you can detect with a minimally invasive procedure, it's a test, what other things go into play? So how might you make this test more effective? Well, one way you could make it more effective is to increase the base rate. If you increase the base rate, if you now have every 1,000 in 10,000 people, 10% base rate, the test is much more effective. Increasing the base rate is better than increasing the effectiveness of the test. The base rate adjustment makes the test more useful and diagnostic because it increases the posterior probability. So how do you increase the base rate? Well, you don't want 10 times more people to have colon cancer. What you want to have is 10 times, you want to have more people who get this test to be likely to already have the disease. And that's, of course, why when you look at public health recommendations for things like colonoscopies, mammograms, prostate specific antigen tests, any kind of test which might be indicative of a particular kind of cancer, you tend to recommend those in cases where the likelihood is already increased. So you don't get a colonoscopy when you're 18. You get a colonoscopy when you're 55 or 65. You might recommend a colonoscopy for individuals who come from a family that has a family history of cancer or colon cancer. You might recommend a colonoscopy for individuals who are of a certain age, who come from a certain particular background that might have a risk, and who have dietary and lifestyle factors. Drink a lot of alcohol, eat a lot of red meat, for example. All of those things are likely to increase, which means that the persons that you're sampling now are from an elevated base rate. You're not giving colonoscopies to everybody. You're giving colonoscopies from people who are already an elevated risk. And the same thing is true for every other kind of test. You don't recommend a mammogram for all women. You recommend a mammogram for people who are of a certain age, a certain risk, certain amount of time. All screening everybody for everything is going to fall into this category where the test is not very effective because the base rate is very low. You can effectively increase the base rate by giving the test to people who have already come in with a complaint, who have a family history, who have a screening, who have tested positive for other things that might be indicative. All of those things go together to help the physician make an informed diagnosis.
Would you ever ask us to try and evaluate base rate neglect questions on the exam? Or are these examples more conceptual?
These examples are conceptual. So the way in which this might be assessed on an exam might be something like to think about whether or not one of these is a better decision. So you might have a multiple choice question that asks you, given the base rate, which of these might be the best outcome? Why would it be the best outcome? You're not going to have a calculator with you. So I won't be asking you to calculate the actual base rates and calculate the posterior probabilities or anything else like that. But I might be asking you to determine which is the better source of evidence. Does that make sense? Okay. That clear to everybody? So when I ask you to know things about probabilities or equations, it's understanding conceptually what's happening. And you'll see in another example when we talk about prospect theory. I'm going to give you some conceptual examples. You won't be asked to necessarily come up with whole numbers or fractions or decimals or anything like that. So I'm not going to be asking you to work things out mathematically. I'll just be asking you to understand why they work that way.
I just had a quick question for the example you're just talking about.
Yeah.
Would that be like increasing the base rate? Do you mean like if you only use the test like after people already tested positive for something else?
Yes. Yeah. So the question, if you didn't hear when I say increasing the base rate, does that also mean using a test for somebody who's already tested positive for something else? That's exactly what I mean. So effectively, it increases the base rate by reducing the number of people in the sample with people who are already more likely to have this disease. By recommending a colonoscopy to men over age 55 with certain risk factors, certain lifestyle factors, it already increases the base rate. So you're not giving the colonoscopy to everybody. You're asking only certain individuals to have a colonoscopy. if that makes sense. So these kinds of tests will then be more effective. The test itself doesn't change. What changes is the people you give the test to, and by artificially or effectively increasing the base rate by giving the test only to people who would be more likely to already have that disease. Does that seem clear? Just like when, if you could remember back to the COVID testing era, not everybody had COVID tests at first, right? You had to actually book a COVID test in some sort of special place. Do you all remember back far enough to think that there was a time when COVID tests were only given at like the Oak Ridge Arena in London, and you had to drive up and they would sort of put the little thing in your nose there at the test? So there was like testing centers in London where you could get COVID tests, but you weren't supposed to go unless you were already sick. So they didn't want to give everybody a COVID test. And that was something that people might have asked, like, look, if this is a mass pandemic, why don't we just test everybody and then quarantine the people that test positive? You can't do that because you would only want, because then you'd have false positives. What you want to do is only test people that are already showing symptoms. So they would say, have you traveled to an area, or have you been in contact with someone who has tested positive? Now you might have more likelihood of having that disease. So you've increased the base rate, the posterior probability. Most of us, when we're making decisions, just don't have this information, of course. We don't use it. We don't have it at hand. We rely on memory and biases and so on. Rational decision-making works if you know the base rates, know the risks, know the benefits, and are not swayed by your own beliefs and bias, and we almost never know these things. We are always swayed by our own beliefs and biases, and we rarely know the base rates. And even when we're given the base rates, we don't always use them effectively because we don't have the tools to use them effectively. So at the very beginning, I suggested, what is decision making? So let's talk now about how to combine understanding of probability with several theories that explain how we make decisions. I want to start with contrasting a rational decision maker. So someone, an entity, an agent who would have all of the proper information, all of the base rates, all of the outcomes, all of the risks and benefits, and would then choose the decision that would maximize the likelihood of a good outcome for you. Most of us don't make decisions that way. But that's going to be a rational model. And what we'll use that rational model for is to show how people deviate from rationality and why they do so. So when we're making a decision, we're going to identify the outcome. You know, most decisions need to have an agent that decides, when do I need to make a decision? And these can be big or small decisions. The decision to come to class today, probably a pretty small decision, right? I mean, you can make that every single day that you're in university. You have to decide when, should I come to class today? I was thinking about this when I was walking through the tunnel that connects natural science to physics. You know, that tunnel that connects the bottom and that side of physics. And then you walk through the ground floor of physics and astronomy. And there's a little pillar there that says quantum junction, get in both lanes, which is, I guess, sort of a nerd physics joke. And I usually go to the right, but sometimes I go to the left. And I was thinking, what makes me decide to go to the left sometimes? Is it just, do I just decide to go to the left sometimes? Or is there something that makes me feel on a certain day, 2 times out of every 6, I go to the left or something like that? I don't know what makes me make that decision. Those are the kinds of decisions that you don't really give much thought to, but most decisions give more thought, and we have to frame them. We're going to talk about how context, semantics, and understanding affects your ability to make decisions. The way in which a decision is presented to you, the situation that you find yourself in, can determine whether or not you make a certain decision, even if there are equivalents. We generate alternatives, we evaluate the alternatives based on which is going to be the best for us, and then we often select an option. A lot of decisions really doesn't matter. If you go to a restaurant that has a lot of things that you like, and today you decide to choose a hamburger, and the next time you go there you choose a buffalo chicken wrap, it really makes no difference. If you're getting something at Arby's or Subway, it literally makes no difference because they're all kind of the same. But some decisions have really positive outcomes. Unforeseen outcomes. We're seeing this, unfortunately, play out on the world stage. It's not clear what the outcomes of the U.S. Invasion, the U.S. military action in Iran is supposed to be, because there have been shifting goals. So it's not really clear what's supposed to happen in the end game. Without a clear end game, it's not clear whether or not they've selected some of the correct alternatives. But rational decisions assume that you have the information and you have understanding of the outcomes, whether it's geopolitical decisions, economic decisions for yourself, food decisions, lifestyle decisions, whether or not to hang out with your friends versus study. If you're a rational decision maker, you know the expected value. For whatever that decision is, you know what it's going to be worth to you. And you should choose the thing that's the most valuable to you in the long run. So maybe it's valuable to you to study in the long run. And so you choose that over hanging out with your friends the night before an exam. Your friends will still be your friends the next day, but you really want to study. So you make those kinds of decisions. What's better for me in the long run? Should I suffer a little bit tonight to study and then see my friends the next night? Or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's more worth it because you're familiar and really happy with the information that you've studied. You're comfortable with it, and you decide to hang out with your friends anyway. Maybe that's the better decision in the long run. Maybe your friends are leaving the next day, and so you want to see them before they leave. So I'll use a couple of really simplistic examples. These are terrible examples in the sense that you would never be faced with a decision like this because they're so obvious. But only because they're easy to work out mathematically. So for some particular behavior or outcome or action, you have the option to take $40. You're going to get $40 from this decision, this bet or this gamble. You're going to win $40 with a probability of 0.2. So that's pretty high. That's 1 in 5 or nothing. And you can calculate this by taking an expected value of multiplying the likelihood of winning and subtracting from that the likelihood of not winning. In this case, not winning doesn't cost you anything. That means that if you were involved with this particular decision for the rest of eternity, on average, you would gain $8 of behavior. Most of the time, you don't win because this is a game that would allow you to win every 1 out of every 5 times. But on average, each one of those times averages out to be about $8. Does that make sense? So you're never going to get exactly $8. You get either 40 or 0. But on average, you're always going to gain something. You're always going to gain something in this option. And these things are sensitive to both the probability and the value of the alternative. So you can reduce the value, but increase the probability and increase the expected value. So expected values are sensitive not only to the value of whatever the option is, but the probability of that option working out for you in the long run. So a rational decision maker says, if I know the probability and I know what these things are worth to me, I can calculate the one that's going to be the best for me in the long run. Sometimes I might make a decision that does not actually gain me. I might actually lose something this time. But over the long run, I should choose the options that are the most likely to gain overall. This would be the better option. You would take a smaller amount of money at a higher probability overall, because that's the better option in the long run. We're only offering this choice once. Which one of these is the better one to choose? Well, if you really are focused on the high value, you might be drawn to the one that gives you a lower probability but a higher win. That's how most people make decisions with any kind of gambling, right? Especially if it's a lottery type of setting or a sweepstakes. I'm not a gambler. The last time I spent money on anything was during that end of the year Blue Jays 50-50 that was like $85 million. Do you remember that? It was like the last game, or the second to the last game of the World Series. It was like Blue Jays 50-50. I bought a couple of tickets. I didn't win. I was starting to think, though, what would I do if I had $85 million? That would have been my take home. Tax-free $85 million. I was like, man, this would solve a couple of problems, wouldn't it? I didn't win anything, and I didn't expect to, right? Because you just don't. I knew the probability was low, but the payoff was too high to resist. Plus, I was caught up in all the enthusiasm of the World Series. Framing effects can alter this, though. So we're not rational decision makers. That's the whole point. I was not behaving rationally when I purchased Blue Jays tickets. Actually, I probably was. I knew that this was an enjoyable thing because I had some additional expected utility. I knew that I wasn't going to win, but I was enjoying the process of participating in the collective support for the Blue Jays and the Blue Jays charity, and also the very tiny, tiny, tiny likelihood that I might win $85 million. And then even the enjoyment of thinking about what it would be like to win $85 million. All of that was still worth something, even though I didn't win $85 million. So we're not really behaving rationally completely. We behave in accordance to other things. Tversky and Kahneman call some of these framing effects, and these are deviations from rationality. Framing effects suggest that the way in which a decision is presented to you can affect the outcome, even if mathematically some options are equivalent. Here's how they explain it, and I go through this in the textbook as well. If you're preparing for the outbreak of disease, I apologize that almost half of the examples we've used in this class today have to do with disease. It's just a really salient example in this case. So London's preparing for the outbreak of a disease, and if left untreated, it's going to kill 600 people. That would be kind of a lot for London. So if, whether or not this was a pandemic, a virus, or something like a homelessness crisis, something like a particular increase in drug addiction. Any of these you could imagine being diseases that would kill 600 people. That's a lot of people. You don't want this to happen. Public health has two programs, two ways to combat this. Program number one suggests that 200 people will be saved. So if we do this, we will save the lives of 200 people. If we do B, there's a 1/3 probability, so a 30% chance, that 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. So you've got a certain option, saving 200 people, and you've got a slightly riskier option of saving everybody or saving nobody. Which option do you choose? And what Tversky and Kahneman found is that most people choose option number one, option A. So they like the idea of saving 200 lives. Who doesn't? So this is framed as a gain. It's framed as saving. When they asked a different group of people the same scenario, framed in a loss format, so framed at what you might lose if you made the decision, people's preferences or choices reversed. Framed as a gain, people choose A. Framed as a loss, choosing between option C, which is 400 people will die, and option D, there's a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 will die, people choose the riskier options. So when faced with losing something, people take more risks. When faced with a sure gain, people choose the sure gain. This is going to be adjusted also by overall values. But their insight here is that we switch our preferences. We're more likely to take risks in this case when we're faced with losing something. We're more likely to take a risk of everybody dying because we've got a 1/3 probability that nobody will die. And the other option means 400 will definitely die. Nobody wants to endorse the option that 400 people will die. That's not a desirable option. You're going to have a tough time selling that in public health. If we do this, 400 of you will die. That's not a good option. So most people will choose the risky option only when it seems like there's no other alternative. In this case, it seems like there is an alternative. You can save 200 people's lives. We don't tend to make the mathematical equivalence. Does that make sense to everybody? So in this case, they're both equivalent mathematically, but they're framed in different ways. This is a semantic difference and not a probability difference, not an outcome difference, and not a numeric difference. This affects our choice in lots of different ways. So we're going to go through a lot of these examples from Tversky and Kahneman. The framing of decisions and the psychology of choice. So the next few examples that we're going to talk about how people frame decisions in different ways. We make decisions to avoid regret. We make decisions to maximize gains and to minimize losses. And we're particularly afraid of losing things. Turns out loss aversion is a huge thing for most of us. We don't like to lose what we already have because losing what you already have puts you in a state of uncertainty. Now you don't have something. You might stick with something even if it's not very good, because at least you are certain of what you have. So here are lots of other examples. Let's go a lot of these. These are in Kahneman and Tversky's paper. So they mentioned things where they've asked participants. This is the number of people who answer a certain option. Problems 8 and 9 illustrate another class of situations in which an existing account affects a decision. Problem number 8, they asked 183 people to answer this. Imagine that you have decided to see a play where the admission is $10 per ticket. As you enter the theater, you discover you have lost a $10 bill. This is obviously done at a time when people had cash and no Apple. Would you still pay $10 for a ticket for the play? And the majority say yes. So most people, when it's framed this way, where you bought a ticket, or you didn't buy a ticket, you planned to see it, you were going to buy the ticket, you lost $10 from your stack of cash, but you would still buy the ticket. So the majority of people would say, yes, I will just reach into my wallet, grab another $10 and buy the ticket. I had set aside $10 to buy this ticket, but I walked into the theater with more than just $10, right? So I'm going to go ahead and buy another ticket. Framed a different way, imagine that you've decided to see a play and paid the admission price. You already bought your ticket. As you enter the theater, you discover you have lost your ticket. You're like, where's my ticket? The seat was not marked, ticket cannot be recovered. Would you pay $10 for another ticket? Preference is reversed. The majority now say no, they would not pay it. There's something about holding the ticket in this case and losing it that changes people's decisions. They haven't purchased the ticket yet in the first example. Mathematically, these things are the same. Everybody's going to be out an extra $10. But in the first case, they haven't purchased the ticket yet. They actually haven't made the action. They don't physically possess a ticket yet. Presumably they have more than $10, so they just buy another ticket. You could probably imagine yourself in this scenario where you buy something that you didn't expect just because of the way in which it was carried out. But in this case, they've purchased a ticket. We're going to call this an endowment effect. Once you have something physically in your possession, it takes on more value. The ticket is only valued at $10, but here it seems to be as if people are valuing it more than $10 because they already have it. They're unwilling to buy a second ticket once they've lost the one that they already have. Framing effects also affect the way in which you might make decisions, because the way in which decisions are framed to you suggests you're either gaining or losing, even when they're mathematically equivalent. Driving down the road, your car's running low on gasoline. Station A, I wish it was $1 a liter. It's like $1.80. What is it, like $1.70 a liter now when I was driving? $1.67?
I filled this weekend like at 192.
Oh my God, that's awful.
Gas too, so it was just so expensive.
Yeah, I filled up with gasoline a week and a half ago, and it was like $1.30, and I was like, it's going to go higher. And now I'm going to be coasting on fumes down to the Costco to see if I can go the Flying J or wherever it is. That's another one too, because like you have to decide how far am I willing to drive to get cheap gas, right? The gas might be cheaper at Costco South or at the Flying J or in Oneida, but that's a longer drive to get the cheaper gasoline. So you have to decide whether or not it's worth it. So station A's price is $1 per liter. Station B says 95 cents a liter. So based on nothing, you should say I go to station B, right? Because it's 95 cents. It's cheaper. It's 5 cents cheaper. But station A has a sign that says 5 cents liter discount for cash. Station B says 5 cents liter surcharge for credit cards. Equivalent, it's going to be equivalent. All factors being equal, for example, cleanliness, whether or not you like the brand of gasoline, number of cars, which station would you choose to go? How many would still go to station A, even though it's $1 more, but they give you a discount, versus station B, they have a surcharge if you use a credit card. These are equivalent. It depends on how you're going to pay. It's going to depend on whether or not you think you're getting a good deal. But this is not an uncommon way to price things. To give people an additional charge if they're using a credit card, or to give people a discount if they use cash. In this case, mathematically, they're equivalent. These are both exactly the same price. They're the same price if you pay cash. They're the same price if you pay credit card. You're either going to be called in by the lower price, or you're going to be enticed by the possibility of a discount if you use your debit card and not a credit card. I mentioned the idea of an endowment effect. The endowment effect goes along with two other concepts that I want to discuss over the next 5 minutes. And this has to do with loss aversion and status quo bias. All of these things are connected. Status quo bias means all things being equal, we actually like stuff to stay the same. Humans, just like every other animal, don't like uncertainty. There's nothing good about uncertainty because you don't know what's coming next. Certainty is good because you know what's coming next. And if you know what's coming next, you can kind of relax a little bit. Life doesn't cause anxiety. Last year, we went to Copenhagen, Denmark, and I had never been to Copenhagen before. And we were there for a week. This was really just to celebrate my wife and I's 25th anniversary. We went last June. It was like, let's go somewhere different. But we haven't been. Let's go to Copenhagen, Denmark. Why not? One of the things that amazed me the most has anybody ever been to Copenhagen, Denmark? One of the things that amazed me the most about Denmark is their subway system. There's a lot of nice things about Denmark, but the subway system was the thing that completely blew me away. The reason is, first of all, it's fully automated. There are no drivers. If there are no drivers, there's nobody to drive it wrong, right? It's a completely automated system. Second, a car comes every 7 minutes, wherever you are at any given stop. So that reduced everybody's anxiety massively. How many of you find yourself feeling anxious on the TTC? I mean, yes, it's an anxiety-causing way to travel. The Copenhagen subway was not, because if you were late and you didn't get to the car, you knew without fail that another car was coming 7 minutes later, that you would just have to wait an additional 7 minutes. Nobody was stressed out about everything because it was a completely reliable system. There was no uncertainty. They had removed uncertainty from the public transportation system. So people were generally kind of relaxed and happy when they were on the subway, which is the opposite of how you often see people on the TTC. You don't see people relaxed and happy. You don't see people relaxed and happy when they're driving on a busy expressway. But if you're driving or commuting in a place where there is very little uncertainty, you can relax. So we don't like uncertainty. We like status quo. We like to know what's coming. That means that we don't like to lose things. If you lose something, you don't know what's coming next. I won't ask for you to raise your hands, but how many of you would have found yourself or know someone who has stayed in a relationship longer than they should have just because they didn't want to be alone? So you might stay with a partner who is probably not ideal. Maybe you stay with a partner a little bit longer than you should because the alternative is to not have anybody for a little while or to find someone else who's worse. So we often make those kind of decisions. We keep something even if it's not good because at least we're comfortable with it. That's loss aversion. And endowment effect. So these things are connected. We like the status quo, which means we don't want to lose something. We don't want to lose something. And so we tend to give what we have more value than it otherwise should. As soon as we have it, whether it's a person, an object, a concept, or a thing, or anything, or a belief, once you have it, you endow it with more value than it otherwise would have. In other words, once you have it, it's more valuable to you than someone else. Once you have it, you think it's worth more than you would pay to get it from someone else. If you sell stuff on Facebook Marketplace, you probably think that what you have is worth more than what somebody else is going to pay for it. And that's how marketplaces work, right? You put in the value that you think something is worth, and somebody decides whether or not it's really worth that much. They either pay for it or they don't. So here's an example. So all of these things go together, and what roots them together is our avoidance of uncertainty and our avoidance of loss. Nobody likes to lose what they have. This is true for animals. This is true for non-human species. This is true for humans. We do not like to lose something. A wine-loving economist we know purchased some nice Bordeaux wines years ago at low prices. Economists, I guess, are the kind of people who would do this. The wines have greatly appreciated in value, so that a bottle that cost only $10 when purchased would now fetch $200 at auction. This economist now drinks some of this wine occasionally, but would neither be willing to sell the wine at auction price nor buy an additional bottle at that price. Thaler called this pattern the endowment effect. And even if you're not wine collectors, you probably have things in your possession, whether they're objects or investments, that you treat in roughly the same way. If you were someone who has or does speculate on crypto markets, for example, those things go up and down, right? If you speculate on silver or gold, as things are increasing in value, what's the likelihood that you're going to sell them? Or do you just keep them and hope that they will stay at a high value? So if you have in your possession real gold and silver, unlike an investment in a crypto account, you really have those things. You probably want to keep them. You probably think they're worth more than they are. And so you wouldn't necessarily buy the equivalent amount of silver if you wanted to replace it, but you probably also wouldn't sell it. You have a box of gold, and I mean, I'm assuming that nobody has a big box of gold, but you know what I mean. If you have a box at home, or a safety deposit box, or a safe that has something valuable in it, you keep it there. You're willing to keep it as it goes up and down in value. And this is called an endowment effect. It illustrates status quo bias, and it all illustrates this idea that Kahneman and Tversky, which we'll talk about in just a minute, call loss aversion. In other words, the disutility means something that's not useful to you. It no longer has utility. The disutility of giving up an object is greater than the utility associated with acquiring it. In other words, for the very same action, behavior, decision, or object, the pain of losing is greater than the equivalent amount that you would seek to gain that same object. We like to gain, but we hate to lose even more. A couple of different experiments we'll talk about. This is all from the same paper. An early laboratory experiment demonstration of the endowment effect was offered by Knecht and Sinden. Participants in this study were endowed with either a lottery ticket, so let's say scratch-off type ticket, or with $2, which might be what you would pay for a scratch-off ticket. Sometime later, each subject was offered an opportunity to trade the ticket for the money or vice versa. Very few subjects chose to switch. Those who were given lottery tickets seemed to like them better than those who were given money. So once you had a $2 lottery ticket, you endowed it with more value, even if it wasn't worth anything yet. Right now, it was only worth $2. That's what you paid to get it. So most people endow it with more value. And we see this kind of thing all the time. So another way to discuss this is to talk about sunk costs. I gave you the example of staying in a relationship longer than you might otherwise because you were unwilling, afraid, or unable to get out of the relationship. Or because you might say, well, we've been together for so long. We've already been together for 2 years. We've put 2 years, we've sunk 2 years into this relationship. You don't want to let that all go to waste. That's sunk cost. So when you sink time, effort, or money into something, you feel as if you need that equivalent amount back. And the longer you've sunk, or the more money you've sunk, or the more time you've sunk into something, the harder it is to decide to let go of it. You spend $12 to see a movie. By the first half hour, you know it is horrible, an unwatchable film. I'm sure, how many of you have been in movies where you think, there's no way I'm going to watch this whole thing? Mostly you're going to get that. I mean, this example doesn't work as well in a streaming atmosphere because, I mean, there's probably hundreds of series you've started and never finished because you're like, this is boring. This isn't any good. I don't really like this. This isn't interesting. You can start a Netflix series and just abandon it. So the example doesn't work as well. But if you really pay money for the movie and you know it's horrible, should you stay or should you go? How many of you would leave after 20 minutes of a movie that you've paid for because you know it's horrible? That's a good decision. Many people do not. Equivalent, maybe, in the streaming atmosphere, how many of you own at least one streaming platform that you do not use very much? And you think, why am I paying for this? And you continue to pay for it. I had Apple TV. I mean, I rent movies on Apple TV, but I don't watch anything on Apple TV. I think I might have Amazon Prime Video. I can't remember the time. I don't think I've ever watched anything on that because it comes with Amazon Prime anyway. So you probably have streaming services that you pay for that you just don't really get your value from, but you're unwilling to quit them because you've had them for so long. Any kind of subscription plan is like that. The reasons that most people offer it in experiments like this is that you've already paid for it. Once you've paid $12 for a movie, even if it's bad, you stick around anyway because you think, well, I've paid for this. I'm not going to leave now. I've sunk some costs into it. Other examples that I've come up with are paying for an all-you-can-eat buffet, going to Mandarin, for example. That's a lot of money, and you feel like you need to get your money's worth. So you eat probably more than you otherwise would because you've paid for it, right? Any of these kinds of examples, if you've invested in something and you've put money in it, a subscription, a relationship, we don't tend to part with it because we've invested time in it. Kahneman and Tversky explain all of this with a theory they call prospect theory. And what they suggest is that humans don't behave rationally because we look for prospects. We tend to look for prospects of what we can gain, and we look for prospects of what we won't lose. And what they suggest is that underlying all of this is that we display loss aversion and risk aversion. There are two things that frame or describe a lot of our abilities to make decisions and hamper a lot of our abilities to make decisions. And one of them is we don't like to lose. And the other one is we don't like to risk anything. What's underneath both of those is an avoidance of uncertainty. Risk carries with it some uncertainty. Losing carries with it some uncertainty. So they suggest that expected values really should be adjusted for some kind of framing effect, a reference point. We don't go in making decisions objectively. We go in making decisions looking at them from the perspective of, am I going to gain something? Or the prospect of, am I going to lose something? And that changes the way you make the decision, whether or not you're looking at it as a loss or a gain. And objective probability is usually overshadowed by psychological probability. In other words, your knowledge effects, whether these are belief personal theories that Barron talks about, or frequency theories that are affected by recency and availability and representativeness, that objective probability isn't something we tend to use. So we use subjective psychological probability, and we adjust our decisions based on how we're looking at the decision. So I want to show two curves. In the past, I think I've often asked not a multiple choice, a short answer question where I ask you to sort of draw these kinds of curves and explain certain things. If I have a short answer question that asks about prospect theory, it's usually to draw the curve and to explain certain types of effects using that curve. So just thinking about gains, one of the things that turns out to be true for our decision making when it comes to gaining things is that not all gains are the same. A function for how you might value certain things based on what they would gain you, it's not a linear increase. It tends to be a concave function. In other words, a gain of $100 objectively and a gain of $200 objectively, one is twice as good as the other, right? So something that gets you $100 is great. Something that gains you $200 is better. And objectively, it's twice better, right? It's worth twice as much. But in people's decision making, they won't value it as being subjectively twice as good. There is a point at which the amount of things that you might gain starts to level out. You reach an asymptote. There's only so much you can comprehend. There's only so much you can gain. You like to gain and you like to gain more, but at a point it becomes difficult to determine. And most of us, when we're asked to sort of behave in a way that suggests we've ranked these, will show tapering off of the subjective value for these gains. So the gain portion of a objective-subjective curve is not a straight line. It's not a linear function, it's a concave function. Furthermore, The loss side, so I've got the gain side. This is the same gain side of the curve here. The loss side also is not linear, and it's a much steeper curve. So for the same objective amount, a gain of $100 or a loss of $100 objectively should be the same thing. This is kind of like that ticket example. You can either you can either pay an additional $10 for the ticket, or you've lost the $10 ticket. That changes the way you think about this. If you're thinking about something as a gain, you think about what you stand to gain. If you're thinking about it as a loss, it has a much bigger psychological effect. Losses of the same amount tend to have a bigger impact on people. We rate them as being more painful than the gain of something would be desirable. This in theory explains things like the status quo bias and the endowment effect. We don't like to lose what we already have. We give it a higher value than it otherwise would have. We don't tend to pay as much to gain something we already have. If you lose something, if you lose a ticket, you don't pay an additional $10 to get that ticket. That was the point of Kahneman and Tversky's example. If you lose something that you own, you might not pay what you paid to get the exact same thing back because you've lost something that is no longer brand new, but it was important to you because you already endowed it with higher value. So this loss function drops off more steeply. Loss aversion, a loss has a greater absolute psychological value, or as Kahneman and Tversky put it, a disutility than the equivalent amount of gain. Does that make sense to everybody? So if I were to ask a question, which I often have on a final exam, about drawing the prospect theory curve and use it to illustrate an example like loss aversion, you might reproduce something that looks just like this and say a loss has a greater absolute psychological value than a gain. That would be a way to sort of explain that type of behavior. It is not certain that this question will be on the final exam, but it's a question that I've used. Does that seem okay? All right, we are rapidly getting to the end here. We're almost at 12. I think we're going to finish up at 12:05. Let's just talk about knowledge effects briefly, and then I think we can wrap things up. So how do you manage knowledge in your decision making? Most of us want a reason. That's another thing we want, is a good reason to make a decision. It's hard to defend a decision if you don't have a good reason. How many of you have ever been in a situation where somebody says, "Why did you do that?" And you say, "I don't know." That is not, yeah, I've said this. It is not an acceptable answer in many cases, especially if it's a decision that you made that affected somebody in a negative way. They're like, "Why did you do that?" You're like, you got to have a good reason to make your decision. So many of us might choose outcomes that we can justify, and we avoid outcomes that we cannot justify. Tversky showed this in an example, an experiment where participants were given a series of different scenarios. And they were asked to determine whether or not they would make a deposit on something. But it turned out that the information they had at hand affected their decisions. So imagine you have finished a difficult final exam. You're walking home. You will not find out whether or not you passed the exam until tomorrow afternoon. That's a really quick turnaround time for a difficult final exam. But you don't know. You think you did. You have no way of knowing. It was really a hard exam, and you're not going to know for a little while. Travel agent advertises a trip to Acapulco, to Mexico. That sounds great. Offer expires that afternoon, but you can pay a mere $5 to hold it. Hold the reservation until tomorrow. That's not a lot. Do you sign up to take the trip or pay the $5 fee? Set aside the fact that no travel agent in the world is going to ask for only $5. I mean, I can't even make a reservation on Open Table without laying down a credit card up front. A majority of people, given this scenario, said they would pay the $5. So all that Tversky and Kahneman wanted, all that Tversky wanted to show is that if you don't know why you're going on this trip, you don't know how you did in this exam, there's some uncertainty here. You're like, "I'm not going to know until tomorrow. I'm going to hold my place. I'm just going to put down $5, and then tomorrow I'll decide whether or not I'm going to book this trip." Nothing, there's no cost other than the $5. I'm not guaranteed, I don't have to take this trip. I'm not locked into it. I've just held it for a day. Then two other groups are run through this example. One group is told they passed the exam, but most choose to go and not pay the $5. Most just sign up. Another group was told they failed to imagine they failed the exam. Again, also chose to take the trip and not pay. And what Tversky reasoned was that people took the trip if they had a reason. They could either go to celebrate or they could go to make themselves feel better after failing the exam. Either way, they had a reason. And once they had a reason, there's no reason to defend, there's no reason to defer. And what they suggested is that sometimes people, in order to avoid uncertainty, are willing to pay a little extra money to avoid the uncertainty. If you knew that you failed, you're going to go. If you knew that you passed, you're still going to go. So they're paying for information that isn't really going to affect their choice, but all it's going to do is avoid the sense of uncertainty. They're paying for information to avoid uncertainty. I talked about decisional conflict at the beginning of the example. Decisional conflict also affects our ability to make decisions. This is a classic example of, I would call this like a Costco example. A related pattern observed at a grocery store where shoppers were offered a chance to taste any of 6 jams in one condition. So you get 6 different jams you can taste, or 24. I don't even know how you could have 24 different jams, but imagine a scenario in which there are 24 different kinds of jams. That's a lot of jam. In the 6 jam conditions, 40% of shoppers stopped to have a taste, and of those, 30% proceeded to purchase. So you get 6 things, you taste one, you're like, yeah, it's kind of good, this elderberry jam. I think I'll take this one. In the 24 jam, more people stopped, but only fewer purchased. A couple of reasons. One is you might taste something you don't really like because there's too many to choose from. But the conflict, the suggestion is the conflict between so many attractive options proved hard to resolve. Further studies found those choosing goods from a larger set reported lower satisfaction than their chosen option with those choosing from a smaller set. So most of us, even though we like choice, are often unhappy with too many things to choose from. Happier when we have fewer options to choose from. What's one of the possible reasons? Well, one possible reason is regret. If you've got 24 things to choose from and you chose one, what if you chose the wrong jam? I mean, you didn't try all 24. And even if you did try all 24, how do you rank all 24 so that you buy the best one? It's easier when there are fewer options. We don't like regrets. That was something we talked about at the very beginning of this class. So imagine you come to this very class. Every year I've used this example. I don't use this every year, but on years when I've used this example, I always say, I should actually do this. I should bring the actual tickets and have a real cash value. And every year I forget to do it. Or maybe I'm just too cheap to do it. Imagine you come to class and I give you a ticket to win a prize, cash prize. You are given the option to trade your ticket to the person beside you before the drawing takes place. So you know what that means. Your ticket is not a winner yet. It's not a winner until I actually draw the winning value, right? Everybody has effectively a simultaneously, it's like a quantum problem, right? Your ticket is simultaneously a winner and a loser until I've drawn the winning number. So your ticket has the same chance of winning as anyone else, has the same chance of losing as anyone else. So you're seated next to each other. One of you has a ticket, the other one has a ticket. It's an even trade, but most people elect to keep their ticket. Why? Because the suggestion is you would experience regret if you traded your ticket with someone and theirs ended up being the winner. You just traded away the winning ticket. Or you might experience regret the opposite direction. Maybe they traded the winning one away and now you feel guilty that you got their winner. Either way, there's a regret going on there. And so most of us will choose not to make this trade. We'll choose to keep what we already have because we don't want to regret making the wrong decision. Another way, we're almost finished with these examples here. So another option has to do with reactance. Most of us have experienced reactance at one point or another. This is a really common response, especially when you are a little younger, maybe when you're an adolescent and you're still living at home as a teenager. You're living at home and let's say you're in high school and You have a sense of what you would like to do with your life. You have a sense of how you would like to conduct yourself on a daily basis with your friends. And maybe you have certain things you'd like to do. Many of them might clash with what your parents think you should do, right? So those things don't always line up. But how many of you have made a decision that your parents objected to, whether it was just, going out late or whatever, and you know that your parents are actually right, but the fact that they suggest something actually makes you want to avoid it even more? This is called reactance. Reactance is when you make a decision, you choose an option, you avoid the right option merely because you feel as if you have no choice. This is a resistance arising from restrictions of freedom. People are less likely to favor an alternative, even if they know that their choices are being limited, even if they would have favored that alternative anyway, and even if it's the best choice. What we heard from a lot of people when Western 3 years ago was suggesting that all students had to have a COVID vaccine. And this was true across Ontario, is that people would say, I'm not against the vaccine, I'm just against being forced. I'm against the mandate that everybody has to have a vaccine. I think the vaccine makes sense, but I don't want you to tell me that I have to get it. Somehow being told that you have to do something makes you feel as if you have less freedom. We want the freedom to be able to make that choice. So that's what reactance means. So how do we deal with this? This is the last example I want to cover, and I talked about this at the very beginning of this course, and that is to adopt occasionally a satisficing approach. Satisficing is a term that was coined by Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon is one of the founders of the sort of modern understanding of artificial intelligence. So he's a computer scientist, cognitive scientist at Carnegie Mellon University in the 1960s and 1970s, studied how experts think, studied how computers think, and also realized that especially when computers are trying to solve problems, they try to search for the right outcome, the best outcome. Sometimes the best outcome is impossible to achieve, and if you set somebody on the task of achieving the best possible outcome, and that outcome is impossible, what happens? The project stalls. The person cannot make a decision because they cannot do what you ask them to do, which is choose the best alternative, optimize your life, do the thing that is best for you. But if you can't do it, then you're kind of stuck, paralyzed. Satisficing is a way around that, which is to embrace the idea of being deliberately suboptimal. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't seek to do your best. It means that you would not always seek to optimize all the time. It means that you might want to set a goal, a criterion, and as soon as you achieve that criterion, you can move on to the next problem. It might not mean that you choose the best option. It means you choose an option that satisfies your goal, and that's what satisficing means. Example that I use, you're the hiring manager at a supermarket. You work at No Frills, and your job is to hire somebody to work at No Frills who will help with, actually No Frills is not the right example. I need Loblaws here. I want the fancy version, not the No Frills. I want some frills here because I want somebody who's actually going to be able to bag groceries. So this is a fancy grocery store, not the No Frills grocery store. So you want to hire somebody to check you out, but you also want somebody who works at the front who can help bag the groceries. I did this when I was in graduate school. I worked at a grocery store and mostly worked either at stocking at night because that was something I could do conveniently, or I just worked in the front and just sort of assisted with bagging. I didn't actually check anybody out. So I was just kind of a general low-level employee running around doing a variety of things, and I bagged groceries. It was great fun. So if you're the hiring manager and you just want somebody to do the bagging part, you got 100 applicants, tough labor market, you got 100 people apply to this job, you could interview every one of those 100 people. You could also run every one of those 100 people through the amazing race of grocery bagging, a contest to see who could bag groceries the fastest and the most effectively. That's going to take a long time, and it's going to be expensive and resource intensive. Meanwhile, you're still without a bagger, right? You still are one person short at your grocery store. The cost of hiring anybody who can at least bag groceries, but isn't necessarily the best, is kind of low because the range of quality between the best grocery bagger and the least good grocery bagger probably isn't that much. It's a task that probably the average grocery bagger would be sufficient for what you need and what you're planning to pay. So you would simply take the first person who looks like they can do the job. You wouldn't interview all 100. You would interview a small subset and you would say, yeah, it looks like, can you start tomorrow? And that might be an example of satisficing. So you don't go through all of the options. You don't look to hire the best person. You just look to hire the first person who's good enough, who meets the basic criteria. Satisficers, it turns out, are generally happier than optimizers. A number of studies have been done in the personality area suggesting that if you strive to optimize, you're going to be frustrated because you won't be able to optimize all the time. People who choose a satisficing approach, oftentimes, generally a little bit happier because things don't always go your way. If you're willing to accept that, it can be a little bit easier. So, final thoughts, take the time to think through the important decisions that you need to make, which if you're third and fourth year students, there will be many, I assume, important decisions that you need to make over the next few years. So you got to take time to think through important decisions, but recognize your own limitations and biases. And don't get hung up on decisions that don't seem as important. Try to engage system 2 when you can and understand that system 1 isn't necessarily giving you the wrong answer. It's usually just trying to save you time to do the things that really matter. Okay, if there's anything that seems foggy, let me know for next week. Next week, we're going to talk about problem solving, and we're also going to have quiz number 4 next week. So it'll cover the last 3 weeks. See you next week. Enjoy the rest of the week today. Hopefully the weather turns and we leave winter behind.
Hello.
Have you contacted